Thank you for joining us today. So, we're going to talk about Jewish history, and this is in conjunction with an assignment that you're working on for a review of a PBS film entitled 1913 Seeds of Conflict. So, we're going to get started here and just cover a very broad overview of Jewish history with emphasis on the Middle Ages, emphasis on Zionism, emphasis on World War II, as well as American Jewish history. So I pray that you all enjoy this lecture and reach out if you have questions, comments, or concerns. So let's get going. So the Jewish people are a people like no other. They've been massacred, exploited, demolished, and imprisoned. However, the Jews have also experienced courage, persistence, strength, and peace. Their capital city actually means city of peace, Jerusalem. Salem is a form of shalom, which is a Hebrew word you might be familiar with. So the first Jewish diaspora is complex, and the diaspora just means the disbursement. So you can kind of hear the similarities in those terms. And the first one is biblical. So it occurred somewhere around 587 BC. If you are familiar with biblical history, then you might know the story about how the kingdom split into two empires, north and south, and the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria. They sort of disappeared, and that we call them the lost tribes of Israel. Many of them settled in Greece and became the Hellenistic Jews, who are mentioned in the New Testament of the Bible. And then you have the kingdom of the south, Judah. They were conquered by Babylon, and it was two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and they're the ones who came back after 70 years in exile in Babylon and repopulated Israel. Now, the second diaspora, which you may remember we covered earlier this year, occurred in AD 70 when Rome pillaged Jerusalem. And so in AD 70, the Jews dispersed to various parts of Europe and Asia, and they created settlements. And so each region became known with a specific name. And as you complete your movie review, you will need to recognize these names because they're mentioned sporadically throughout. So you've got Ashkenazi Jews are in the Holy Roman Empire, that area, so Germany, parts of France, right? And then you have Sephardic Jews who settled in Spain, and also a little bit of France, but mostly in Spain. You know, you have the Pyrenees Mountains that divides that peninsula. And so then you also have Jews in the Middle East. Those are known as Mizrahi Jews. And you have other Jews in Russia and also the Khazarian Jews. And I've got some maps on here that will kind of bring this home and help you guys understand these divisions. So here, about 2000 BC, you can see early Jewish migrations. And so you've got, the Tigris and Euphrates River. This is Babylon. You've got Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. And so you can kind of see them spreading out, going into Egypt and then back over here to Hebron. And, and of course, Abraham was the founder of the Jewish nation according to biblical content. And so they also were enslaved in Egypt, as I'm sure you probably have read in the book of Exodus. And the route of the Exodus is somewhat unclear, but you can kind of see here. You can pause and maybe read some of these captions if you're interested in that. I have a lot of maps, so I'm going to kind of go through these rather quickly. So you can see here, these are some settlements in Egypt. Some scholars think that Joseph's tomb might be located here, that, these little pyramids were symbols of people of status. And we know that Joseph was a person of status, so it's very possible that this could have been his tomb. We're not 100% sure. But then you have the 12 tribes of Israel. And again, we're talking about settlement. So this would be after leaving Egypt, wandering in the desert for 40 years. Then they settled in these regions with the 12 tribes. And Egypt, of course, Israel, of course, is here, where you see the flag. So then you have the destruction of Jewish independence. So this is 722 to 586 BC. And this is sort of what I just described, where you have Israel divided into north and south and conquered by surrounding countries. You also have the Kingdom of David. This is 1000 to 925 BC. Actually, let me go back. 722 to 5. Yeah, so this is a little bit out of order here. I pulled these maps out of a book called Atlas of Jewish History, just in case you're interested. It's available at my local library. I'll put a link to it in the reading and study materials as well if you guys want to check it out. But this is the Kingdom of Solomon. And so, again, these are really just like biblical maps, standard biblical maps that you would find in the back of your Bible if you happen to have a Bible with excellent maps. Some Bibles only offer a few maps for certain things. So, this is kind of a good supplementary atlas. Then you have the Jewish dispersion, so 722 to 586. You can kind of see them going through Egypt into Antioch here. You've got Mesopotamia and other regions. So again, this is very early on. You're looking following Assyrian and Babylonian conquest, and it just kind of gives you an overview of where some of these tribes might have settled. Then you have imperial power. So you have the Babylonians, Persians, you have Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies of Egypt, which all of which we studied last semester. So hopefully you guys remember some of this information and can kind of piece this together. You also have the Jews of Persia. And again, you can pause and kind of look through some of this if you want. And you have Jews of North Africa before the Arab conquest. So now we're getting into AD, so 500 BC to 750 AD. And remember that Islam was created around the 7th century, so like somewhere around 630 AD. And so you have the Jews kind of trying to figure out where are they going to fare best? Is it going to be in the Christian territory or will it be in Muslim regions? And a lot of them discovered that Muslim regions offered them more freedom. And so this is, they really partnered with the Muslims a lot in this period that's known as late antiquity. And so then you have the Hasmonean Jewish kingdom. And so you can kind of see the towns and cities here. This is somewhere around 63 BC. Again, some of this is a little out of chronological order, but you're looking at the time of Herod the Great, the building of the temple and things like that. And then you have Jews of India. And so this is 175 BC to 1795 AD. And so Jews were settling in India rather early on, and the population grew. You have Jewish risings against Roman rule here. And again, I won't go into all of these things. You can pause and read. And also Jews and Islam, which I just discussed. And we talked about this. As you complete your book review, one of the major things you're going to want to know is the Ottoman Empire. So make sure you're well versed on the history of how that empire was created and also how it declined, but how it impacted Jewish settlements and religion as well. So then you have Jewish condition under Muslim rule. Again, you can pause here and read if you like. And Jews of China. So while we tend to think of Jews being located in Israel, you can see through all of these maps that the Jews really settled in many different places, especially after that second diaspora. And so here's another one. This is the Khazarian kingdom near Russia that I had mentioned. The Byzantine Jews. And again, this was around the same time as the Muslim Empire was expanding. You have Jews in France. Jews in Germany, Jews of Central Europe, Jews of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. And so during this time, especially going back to the Middle Ages, you have mistreatment of Jews, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Anti-Semitism is sort of a controversial term, and I hope to provide some clarification on it as this presentation goes along. Some scholars argue that although the concept of anti-Semitism may have existed, it really didn't take shape until after the Industrial Revolution. And the reason is because it's the reason why the Jews were hated. You know, they were hated for their religion because Europe was mostly Christianized. And so the issue there is not so much that they're a Semite, right? Remember, we talked about the definition of Semite last semester as well. It really had more to do with the rejection of Jesus as the Messiah and their, trying to live in a Christian society that accepts Christ. And it created a lot of tension. And so, overall, Jews maintained a strong work ethic and prosperous determination. The Jews experienced deplorable treatment throughout the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment, which is well documented. For example, in 1506, Jews were massacred in Portugal by zealous Dominican monks. In 1519, over 800 Jews were forced to leave Regensburg, Germany, and 5,000 Jewish gravestones were demolished and used for building projects. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible refused to allow Jews to live among his people. And in 1563, he ordered the drowning of 300 Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. He's a good looking fella, huh? And so, one of the most notorious events occurred in Spain in 1569 under the reign of Philip II, who ordered the establishment of the Inquisition in the New World. Now, later on, between 1648 and 1658, reckless torture occurred under the Cossacks in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Now, in spite of all these things, we also want to consider kindness to Jews. Not everybody treated them terribly. Some people were actually very nice to them. And so they found a lot of friends in various places. Eventually, the Cossack uprisings were unsuccessful, and the Russian government confiscated the Cossack churches and leased buildings to the Jews. In 1551, Sigismund II allowed Jews to settle in Vilna, Poland, and later offered them a charter of freedom. Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire was generous in his treatment of Jews, and he even offered them positions in the government. So that brings us to Ashkenazi Jews. So again, be familiar with this term. These are Jews who settled in the Holy Roman Empire region, and this is after the Second Diaspora. And Ashkenazi Jews probably developed the most distinct identity of all the groups that arose out of this diaspora. This is evidenced in various ways. So Yiddish is a variation of Hebrew, and so that comes from the Ashkenazi Jews. Also, the gefilte fish line, if you've ever heard of that, they developed these unique ways of making food. And so some like their fish salty and others liked it sweet. And there was a line as to which culture was where, and they call that the gefilte fish line. They also had major ideologies that arose from this group, such as communism and anti-Semitism. Marxist Jews. There is an excellent book I had to read for one of my doctoral classes called The German Empire, and it really focuses on political parties in Germany. It's quite an interesting read if you're into political history. And so the historian Wheeler argued in his monograph that the Ashkenazi Jews pushed for a complete civic equality. This was a little bit different than other regions. Sometimes they just wanted to live peacefully. The Jews in the Dutch Republic, for example, lived very well. They were respected. Jews, typically they're very well educated. They're all very literate, and they're just very smart people. And so they would often earn a lot of income. They were good at mercantilism and things like that. And so some countries saw them as an asset, and they really wanted the Jews to be a part of their society because it bolstered the economy. And so sometimes the Jews would just kind of, live in that kind of position where they're respected, they're adding to the economy, but they still have their own little settlements, and they're kind of considered odd because they have these little cultural traditions that some people think are just very different from, let's say, what the Dutch do or what the Spanish do. They maintain, which is very unique about the Jews. They were able to maintain that tradition. If you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, you kind of know what I'm talking about. If you've never seen that movie, I highly encourage you to watch it. It's long, but it really does a good job. Fiddler on the Roof is about Jews in Russian territory, and you can really see how they preserve that culture. So this push and their industrious tendencies created severe tension. And before long, you have this derogatory term that comes up among Ashkenazi Jews, Marxist Jew, and it became very common. And so anti-Semitism became very common, especially in the Conservative Party. So that was very normal in Germany, even before Hitler. There was sort of a connotation there. And so, in spite of this persecution, Ashkenazi Jews had unique privileges, such as cemeteries. This may sound simplistic to us, but having your own cemetery was a big deal if you were a Jew. And really, after the Second Diaspora, many places didn't allow for that. And so, this freedom encouraged Jewish settlement. And historian Henry Abramson argues that Kehillah, or settlements, are often combated attacks through various organizations, such as so you have the Central Union of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith, and things like that. And, so there was pushback, and in spite of this, they persevered. So Ashkenazi Jews seem to have more works written about them than other groups. If you look at the academic libraries and things like that, there's a lot of articles and books. You have DNA evidence. Some people try to find the Khazarian Jews, and they're trying to figure out if Ashkenazi and Khazarian Jews are connected, which is kind of interesting. The Khazarian Jews who live near Russia don't exist anymore. And so, they're sort of like lost in history. And so it's kind of a little puzzle that historians like to put together. And so let's get into the Industrial Revolution. So that profoundly drove culture and industry, which had a direct impact on the Jewish people. Jews were known to be industrious and hardworking, and they often bolstered the economy in places where they settled. So I kind of already explained that. You have Joel Mokyr is a Jew whose parents were Holocaust survivors, and he talks about this in his book, A Culture of Growth. He argues that the cultural foundations for modern growth were laid between 1500 and 1700. So the Jews that came out of the Industrial Revolution, many of them, especially in Germany, did join the Socialist Party. They felt like conditions had become more difficult in a number of ways. They didn't understand, it did bolster the working class in a lot of ways, but, like we studied earlier in term 3, you can view historians have various perspectives on which they view things, and some of them view the Industrial Revolution as predominantly evil, as an upset to normal life, and others view it as very positive because it created better economic conditions and bolstered the working class. So it depends on how you look at that. Now, Mokyr deals the Haskalah movement, which was basically a Jewish enlightenment. That lasted from somewhere around 1770 to 1880. And so this was, remember, we studied the Enlightenment. We had, you guys remember some of the Enlightenment thinkers that we talked about? John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Montesquieu, and how those ideas led into the revolutions. I don't know if you guys remember discussing that. But so you have, the American Revolution was largely based on Enlightenment ideas, and so was the French Revolution. Well, the Jews were also impacted by the Age of Enlightenment. And so this was a time that they became greater scientists. A number of inventions came from Jewish people. You also have this practice of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism that arose out of the Enlightenment. And so one of the most striking movements to arise from the intersection of Jewish life and the Industrial Revolution was the popularization of communism under Karl Marx. Now, remember, we discussed Karl Marx at length, and he was a Jew. Remember, he was raised by a Lutheran family to avoid persecution. And so there's a really interesting book, In the Garden of Memory. And it's a story of a Jewish family living in Poland. Their name is Horowitz. They're the Horowitz family, and they became involved in the Polish Communist Party. And so this is their memoir about all their involvement and how things kind of took shape. They were affected by personal tragedy, which caused them to really abandon their faith in Judaism and in God in general. And then they found their identity in Polish nationalism. So it's kind of an interesting human story that helps you kind of really put all of this into perspective as to what was happening among Jewish, especially Ashkenazi Jewish families at that time. Okay, so now I told you guys we would get into anti-Semitism and what is it really. And so a major aspect of Jewish historiography involves anti-Semitism. It's a topic that's often misunderstood. So there was a man named Wilhelm Marr, and he wrote this book, The Way to Victory of Germanism over Judaism, and that was written in 1879. Now, as you can imagine, Hitler probably read this book. I believe he mentions it at one point. And because Europe was Christianized, I think it's essential to say that, they were judged based on their rejection of Christ as the Messiah. And you have figures like Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther, who was responsible for the Reformation and the 95 Theses. I'm sure you remember learning about him. When he got into his later life, he spoke out against the Jews. I think he had tried to convert them for most of his life, and he got rather frustrated with them because they refused to convert to Christianity. And so he did publish a couple of anti-Semitic teachings near the end of his life. And so this was actually used by Hitler. In Germany, Reformation Day is still very essential. That's where Luther was from. And so you have this idea that Hitler uh, fed on the teachings of Luther and taught them to the people, you are Christians, and so therefore, you should dislike the Jews because they rejected your Messiah, Jesus Christ. And so this is where we have to be really careful about certain teachings. And I think I talked about this with the Jehovah's Witnesses and other outcast groups as well, that, it's one thing to look at them as being maybe different from you, but how far should we take those ideas to the point of persecution? Obviously is unhealthy for everyone. And so that's kind of what you have going on here. You have the Jews taking advantage of the middle class and the Industrial Revolution. And then the people in Germany kind of noticing this and having a little bit of disdain for it. And so you can also see nuances of European culture in all of this as well. And cultural shifts were occurring, and all of this was based on Enlightenment ideology, Industrial Revolution, economics, and all of these factors combined. So we talked about James Joel's book, The Origins of the First World War. And so the Jewish role in World War I cannot be understated. Perhaps their most influential factor was the anti-Semitism that permeated the Soviet Union. Historian James Joel argues that the Jews could have provided more financial assistance, especially to countries like France, but Russia's ill treatment of the Jews caused them to deny participation in Russian loans. Purity of race was also a concern for a number of European nations, and Jews were noted as a, quote, corrupting cosmopolitan force. Um, Perhaps nowhere, Ukraine was probably the worst country for pogroms, and there was definitely a hatred of Jews because Russia and Ukraine were having a lot of problems even back then. When Russia went through their Bolshevik Revolution. And a lot of the Ukrainians saw the Jews as siding with the Russians, which wasn't always true or the case, but they persecuted the Jews intensely because of that perceived connection. So you can read about that in The End of Tsarist Russia by Dominic Levin. He addresses Russian and Ukrainian Jews in the book, and he says that most Jews lived in the Polish territory that was annexed by Russia. And in 1914, the Poles were seen as disloyal and dangerous to the Russian Empire. They viewed the Jewish presence in Poland as a dangerous overlap. So another historian, Anastasia Strakova, she created several articles. She's a doctoral student from Emory University. And she argues that newly available archival documents reveal that Russian authorities actually they tried to get the Jews to leave the country, basically. They didn't want to persecute the Jews, but they didn't want to deal with the issues because they had other issues that they were trying to deal with at that time as well. I mean, imagine being a major player in a world war like World War One, and then going through your own civil war at the same time, like the Bolshevik Revolution. That was what Russia was dealing with, and so they were trying to alleviate some issues there, and so they would actually provide funds for Jews to leave the country and maybe go to the United States or other places during that time. So that brings us to the Dutch Republic. I kind of mentioned this a few minutes ago. Among all the various responses to the Jewish people, perhaps none was as important as that of the Dutch. They were probably the most essential nation in showing gratitude and acceptance of the Jews. You have Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire allowed the Jews to live and work in the Netherlands. And so Charles V is also the emperor who declared Martin Luther as a heretic, interestingly. And so the Jewish historian Rebecca Voss argues that Charles V and Suleiman the Magnificent were at odds because of the predominant religion in each region. However, their eschatological beliefs seem to bind their ideologies together in profound ways, which resulted in the harmonization of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And so this synthesis is probably what led to much of their kindness towards the Jewish people. Now, Jewish merchants, in addition to religion, like I said, economics played a major role in sympathy towards the Jews, and sometimes anti-Semitism as well. Again, perspectives, right? So it depends on how you look at it. During the 17th and 18th centuries, you have mercantile capitalism. Now, we talked about this a few weeks ago. It evolved into industrial capitalism. So you have, remember, we talked about small scale capitalism versus large scale capitalism, right? Mercantile would be small scale, industrial capitalism would be large scale. And so in 1744, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria considered banning a small Jewish community in Prague, or Prague, however you want to say that. But her advisors argued that the removal of such a talented mercantile people would be greeted with an adverse effect on the Habsburg dynasty. Now, prior to this, the Dutch were one of the earliest nations to recognize the economic potential that the Jewish communities brought to a country. And with few exceptions, the Jews were allowed to live in the Netherlands and embrace their own customs and ways of life. And so this caused the Dutch Republic to become a fulcrum for Jewish freedom and prosperity. Now, that brings us to Zionism. And this is essential as you draft your movie review. You are going to want to know what Zionism is, how it started, and you really, remember you're doing a review, not a paper, right? So you're not summarizing the film, you're critiquing it. And you can't really critique a film on Zionism if you don't know what Zionism is. So make sure you pay close attention here. Many modern Jews in Israel credit Theodor Herzl as the major founder of secular Judaism. Herzl was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1860, which was about 40 years after Isaac Mayer Wise was born in the same country. I'm going to go into him in just a minute. Herzl, who lived at the same time as Wilhelm Marr, and if you remember, Wilhelm Marr wrote the book The Way to Germanism Over Judaism, which is sort of the turning point in terms of what is anti-Semitism. The coining of that phrase, anti-Semitism, comes from Wilhelm Marr's book. And so Herzl he witnessed a vast amount of anti-Semitism in his community, and in particular the Dreyfus Affair, which involved an unjust accusation of a Jewish officer, and it made a notable impact on his worldview as a Jewish citizen. Now, Herzl believed that the best way to eradicate anti-Semitism was to create a Jewish homeland. And this is essential because when you get to the end of World War II, this is exactly what happens. Israel became a nation again in 1948. And a lot of the reason for that is because of the horrific events of the Holocaust. And so here, even long before that, this is the 1800s, you have Herzl arguing that you can, abate some of these problems of Jewish hatred if you just give them a place to live of their own. Then they won't have to assimilate among all these other people, and it will solve the problem. Now, maybe that's being oversimplistic. I invite you to have a discussion on that. I think that's a very interesting discussion. What is the answer to that problem? But that's kind of where Herzl landed on it. And so because Herzl was focused mainly on politics, he fought for separation of church and state. And he argued specifically that the state could not be a theocracy. In other words, what you had in Europe with the Catholic Church ruling, or even in Muslim territories where you had Muslim religion was interwoven with the political structure. He's saying you can't have that anymore. Imagine, and we talked about this, right? Like with Mary Tudor, and she wanted everyone to abandon her father's Anglican church and convert to Catholicism, and she was burning people at the stake if they refused. And that's where I think church and state, the separation of church and state is essential. Herzl also identified himself as a Reconstructionist Jew, and he believed that God had preserved the Jewish nation for a purpose that was larger than dietary laws or Sabbath observances. So some Jews were able to live in Israel next to Palestinians in the late 1800s. And you're going to see this in the film. Most of the Jews who settled early on were Sephardic Jews. And if you remember, that means they're from the Spanish region in Spain. And when the pogroms began in Russia, you have Jews coming from that region as well. Many settlements were named First in Zion or Ray of Hope. The video does talk about that as well. And once the Jews arrived in Palestine in the late 1800s, it was difficult to track them. And so they just sort of assimilated in with the rest of the people. And a Zionist slogan was created, a land for a people without a land. Now, before long, you also have this thing of, it's called Reformed Zionism or Reformed Judaism. I'm sorry, not Zionism, Reformed Judaism. And so, it's the idea that you don't have to follow all these rigorous rules that are provided in the Torah. And so this happened long before Herzl argued for Zionism. It began in Germany. It spread to Austria-Hungary, but it really took shape with a man named Isaac Mayer Wise. So let's see. So yeah, I'm gonna skip some of this about the Jews of Westphalia. I really want to talk about Reformed Judaism. So Isaac Mayer Wise was an American Jew, and he started a theological school in America. So he was I believe he was from Germany, and he immigrated to America, and he traveled up and down the coast, in the original 13 colonies that became our states. And he really promoted his idea that you don't have to follow all of these rules that are in the Torah. Rather, you can be a Jew and have this freedom. And it was extremely controversial at first, and still is in a lot of circles. So when his first group of students graduated from his seminary, they had this incredible dinner where they ate all of these things that were just, against Jewish law, like shellfish, all the dietary laws in the Torah. So they ate. I think it says don't eat a cow and its mother's milk, and so they had some kind of beef pasta and cream and all kinds of things like that. It was almost, some people thought it was very sacrilegious, and so, but a lot of people were very accepting of it, and they felt like it was a freedom that, because of that time and history, they were able to embrace it. And so, long before Isaac Mayer Wise came to America, the first Jewish settlement actually occurred in 1630. And so, this is when the Dutch settled South America and Brazil, and they allowed. Remember, the Dutch would be, the Dutch Republic, the friendly place, and so this became one of the first settlements of Jews in the Americas. And in 1654, you have the Portuguese people who overtook the Dutch, and this forced the Jews to flee. They ended up going to New York, and that's where the very first Jewish settlement was in America. So the Jews living in the region were granted free trade, ownership of property, and the creation of their own cemetery. Remember, I said that was essential. It's a very important thing to them. And by the conclusion of the 17th century, Jews were settling in various regions of North America, including South Carolina, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So you have the first synagogue in America. By the early 1700s, only about 200 to 300 Jews had settled here. Most of them lived in what is New York now. And the first Jewish synagogue was completed in 1730 in Manhattan, and it was named the Shearith Israel, the Remnant of Israel. By 1733, they were actually here in Georgia, in Savannah. And England gave American Jews naturalization rights around this time. And more synagogues were built throughout the mid to late 18th century, including Beth Elohim in South Carolina, Jeshuat Israel in Rhode Island, and the latter is the oldest synagogue still in use today. And so, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Jewish population had risen to about 1,000 to 2,500. Documentation is a little bit unclear. By 1788, Jews were permitted to hold federal offices. Now, this is really interesting because early Americans really didn't want Catholics in office, and the reason for that is because they were concerned about the power of the Vatican that they had seen in Europe, in England, and like with Henry VIII and the creation of the Anglican Church, and just the power that the line between church and state was very fuzzy. And so the early American leaders were more interested in having Jews because at that time, the Jews didn't have control of Israel. They were sort of Bedouin, nomadic people who might have emigrated there, but it wasn't their country. That didn't happen until 1948, like I said earlier. And so, but what else is very interesting about America is that we've never had a Jewish president before. And so, we've had like Goldwater was a Jew. He ran for office, but we've never actually had one. And if you look at modern day events, I think that would be probably a conflict of interest. But again, that would be another really interesting discussion for you guys to have. What are the implications of having a Jewish president? And we do have a lot of Jews who hold public office here in America. So that's essential too. It's just interesting. We've never had a Jewish president. And so, moving on, so by 1800, American Jews numbered somewhere about 2,500. And so, Jews from the region of Germany, so Ashkenazi Jews, didn't arrive in America until the early 1800s. Now, this group focused on social reform, and they constructed the first Jewish orphanage and the Hebrew Orphan Society. In 1813, you have Mordecai Emanuel Noah, who was appointed to the United States consul at Tunis in North Africa. He was a Sephardic Jew from Portugal and a supporter of slavery. And he was known for causing controversy among American Jews as well as other diplomats. Again, these issues at the time, Americans are trying to synthesize Enlightenment ideology with cultural nuances like slavery, and it was a little confusing for them. And, this is not an American history class, but I think it's essential to understand that it really wasn't until the 1840s, 1850s in America that they began to really realize how incompatible those two things were, Enlightenment ideology and cultural practice of slavery. So it took them a minute, but they got there. And so in 1825, Noah founded the first Jewish city of refuge in America. And so the Bible gives an explanation and guidelines for the cities of refuge in Numbers 35. And the basic idea was to provide asylum for Jews who had committed murder unintentionally. So almost like, in the cities of refuge that are in the Bible, if you're familiar with that passage, you kind of know what that is. If you're not, go through and read Numbers 35 just so you have a good understanding of what the city of refuge is intended to be biblically. And so Noah's idea of an American city of refuge was unpopular, and so that led him to become a Zionist, and he lobbied for the creation of a Jewish state in Israel. And then this is Isaac Mayer Wise. I won't go through all of this information. I kind of just told you about him and his work on Reform Judaism. Remember, he was an Ashkenazi Jew. He established the German Library Association of Albany, which is in New York. That was in 1850. And in 1854, he accepted a position to become a rabbi in Cincinnati. So, yeah, I'm going to skip some of this because I feel like we just kind of covered the most salient aspects of the work of Isaac Mayer Wise. The main thing you should know is that he's connected to Reform Judaism. You're welcome to stop, pause the video, and read some of this if you would like. And so here's a copy of his menu. I told it's the Treifa banquet, I believe is what it was called. And so you can see all of the, quote, sacrilegious items he had on this menu that became very controversial. And so, so Reform Judaism evolved slowly. And to say that he instituted the entire reform movement implies that the whole of Judaism revolves around food and other uh, legal restrictions. And so Jewish religion is complex. It consists of many facets, and some historians argue that Wise was the founder of dietary transformation during a major growth period of Reform Judaism. However, he's not the original founder of the movement because remember I said it started back in Germany. He got the idea from someone else, brought it to America, and made it popular. So, in terms of Jewish participation in American government, you have a few early supporters here. Rabbi Morris Jacob Rafal became the first Jewish clergyman to deliver a prayer at the opening session of the House of Representatives in 1860. You have Judah P. Benjamin, who was appointed Secretary of State of the Confederacy in 1862. And Jacob Frankel was appointed the first Jewish chaplain in the United States Army in 1862. In 1826, you have the Maryland Assembly that passed a Jew bill, which prevented Jews from holding office. General Ulysses S. Grant issued an order in 1862 that expelled Jews from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And in 1877, New York banker Joseph Seligman was banned from registering at the Grand Hotel. And this event marked the growth of anti-Semitism in America. So, although we were very friendly in the beginning, and there were instances where this unacceptance, I suppose, increased, and it eventually culminated in the creation of the Anti-Defamation League. So, the American Jews of the 20th century, here's a nice little chart for you. If you want to see immigration to America, you've got Sephardic immigration here. Ashkenazi, German immigration is here. And then Eastern European immigration, Holocaust survivors in 1950, 1960, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, Leo Frank, if you've ever heard of him, there was an incident in Atlanta. I won't go into too many of the details because they're very tragic. If you want to look up the Leo Frank and Mary Phagan incident, you're welcome to do that. But basically, this happened in Georgia at a pencil factory in Atlanta. And it was this incident here that sparked the creation of the Anti-Defamation League. And because Leo Frank was a Jew. And so there's a play made about that called Parade. It's actually going to be at the Fox Theater in April. So I believe that covers our presentation. I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to this. Again, if you want to go back through, I'll post a link to this video so that you guys have it, and reach out if you have questions, and have a wonderful day.